ago the clock washed midnight away, bringing the dawn. Oh God, I must be dreaming. Time to get up again and time to start up again. Pulling on my socks now. Where did the night go?
Welcome everybody. My name is Ailbhe Kenny. I'm beaming in from Limerick on the west coast of Ireland. Welcome to you all wherever you're coming in from today. I'm part of the NITE team who are hosting this conference, and indeed it's the Berlin team specifically who are our hosts, and thank you to them for this great conference. The panel that we're going to hear from this afternoon is looking at urban development and the 24-hour city, expansion of digital nocturnal infrastructures. We've got 4 panelists, and there's a lovely variety actually of topics, but also of speakers today between academic and non-academic speakers, which is really nice to see. So first up, we're going to have Robert Shaw, who's a senior lecturer in Newcastle University, who describes himself as an urban and social geographer. And indeed, many of you, I'm sure, will know Rob Shaw's work as he specifically writes so much about the night. So it's a real pleasure to have you, Rob, with us today. After Rob, we're going to hear from Daniela Wentz, who's from Leuphana University in Lüneburg. She's a postdoc at the Digital Cultures Research Lab. She's going to talk to us about Dreamwork. So that'll certainly be interesting, and digital technologies and the augmentation of sleep. Following that, we'll hear from Andreas Hänel. Apologies for my poor German. Andreas is an astronomer and is here from the working group of the German astronomers and professional astronomers. And indeed, he'll give you the correct German title for that. He's here representing the expert group of Dark Sky. And finally, then, to finish off, we'll have Annette, Krop-Benesch, and she's a chronobiologist. And actually, how lovely, because I know that in our last talk we heard about chronobiology, so we'll get to hear from a chronobiologist as part of this panel. She's particularly interested in light and health, and again she's going to talk to us about sleep. So a nice blend here in this panel about sleep, about mobile materialities, about light. And I'm really looking forward to see how we pull all of that together in the Q&A at the end. So just a little housekeeping. The Q&A will be at the end of all 4. We're going to keep very tight to time. Each speaker will get 15 minutes. And then we move swiftly on to the next speaker once one is complete. And then at the very end of the 4, we'll have a Q&A, and we have a nice time allocated for that, roughly 35 to 40 minutes. So we'll be able to get into a nice deep conversation, I hope. If you have a question for any of the speakers, please type it into the chat. It may occur to you as someone is speaking, you know, from the first talk, second talk. If you're anything like me, type it in when you think of it, because by the time it gets to the 4 speakers, the end of all 4 speakers, believe me, you won't remember what that question was for the first person, perhaps. So I recommend you type it in as you think of it, and it'll all be there for me in the chat, and I'll read out then the questions at the very end. So to begin, Rob Shaw, looking forward to your paper.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the introduction and the invitation. I'll just set up the screen sharing, which hopefully you can all see now. So yes, let me start my timer. Thank you for inviting me as my computer thinks about starting its slideshow function. We'll see if that actually kicks off. There we go. And apologies if I'm a bit rusty or this isn't the most. I know we shouldn't start with apologies, but I'm going to anyway. I'm very much in the middle of 3 years in a very kind of teaching focused role at my university. So it's a great opportunity to be able to talk about research today, but some of these thoughts are necessarily a little bit speculative, and I'm trying to draw together a few materials from across some of my research. And to that end, I want to start with 3 research scenes, which I'll read out before moving on to some of the themes of my talk. So scene 1 is set in an evening in early November 2020. And the UK, where I live, is a few days away from a 4-week mini lockdown that ultimately failed to curtail the growing number of COVID-19 cases in the country. I go out for an evening run. It's a habit that I've picked up since COVID-19 struck and the swimming pools closed. At this point, as an aside, I want to recognise my privilege in being able to do that, both as a white male with relative freedom to use public space at night, but also in the context of the curfews that I know in a lot of countries have formed part of the COVID-19 lockdown, but which haven't been as prevalent here in the UK. Under early November 2020 regulations, the bars and pubs where I live were still able to open, although they closed later in the same week and not reopen until a couple of weeks ago, mid-April. But crucially with a 10 p.m. closing time. My run was slightly mistimed, or rather my daughter mistimed it for me, her bedtime taking a bit longer than usual. As such, I hit the city centre at about 5 to 10. I hadn't seen it so busy in a year. Groups of between 2 and 10 people are leaving those closing bars and wandering out onto the streets. While people are meant to socialise in households only, I live in a university town where a lot of student accommodation is converted family homes that now frequently house 6 or 7 people, sometimes more. And so it's not that unexpected to see people in large household groups. But several of these groups are queuing outside off licences, which are able to remain open until 11 o'clock. So they're queuing to buy drinks to take home to continue their evening. Town is lively, and despite what I'm describing, fairly well behaved. People are a bit loud and groups aren't particularly good at providing space for each other, but there's little evidence of deliberate breaking of social distancing. Nonetheless, I'm very happy to return to the streets which take me out of the town and towards my suburban home, given the COVID-19 infection rate at the time. Scene 2 is a quote from an interview I did in 2012. The research participant is describing a trial, which, as far as I'm aware, I should add, didn't actually lead to implementation of this technology, of new smart lighting technology in the city of Newcastle upon Tyne. I think from an engineering point of view, I would always prefer to dim the lights rather than turn them off. We've just recently got a trial on a couple of streets in Newcastle. It's only about 8 things, but it's an LED unit that's got a passive detection movement for the individual units. And the idea is that if there's no movement on the street, either vehicle or pedestrian, it dims down to a level you can determine what that level is. But as soon as you see any movements, it brings the light up to that level above, up to its new level. Scene 3, also from an interview quote, this from 2019. This was an interview with someone talking about their experiences working as a bike delivery rider, something that they'd done in both Newcastle and Manchester. Again, reflecting on cycling around the city at night. I think I did enjoy it, especially the Sunday night shift was probably my favourite because it was a bit quieter on the roads, or much quieter on the roads, although it could still be pretty busy. So that was nice. I'd never really cycled around a city at night before, so it was quite intimidating at first, especially when I started, it was October. So it was heading towards more wintry weather and things like that. So yes, I think it being in the dark makes quite a big difference with cycling. And even if you're still very visible, it's still just a bit more intimidating, I think. So those are 3 different accounts of experiences in the nighttime city. 2 from research projects, and the third more recent one, just a personal account, but something which I may feed into some emerging research. What links these scenes are different accounts of relationship between mobility and materiality around the city at night. So in scene 1, there were 2 sets of movements going on. Here, there was my own, but I want to focus a little bit more on the groups of people who were leaving bars and clubs in the city centre. In scene 2, the movement itself wasn't really being described so much as an attempt to govern movement and respond to movement through smart city lighting. And in scene 3, the delivery rider was talking about his own mobility, although particularly in relation to others, most notably the cars of the nighttime city. In a short talk, I really want to make 3 key points. So the first is that at night, the relationship between ourselves and our environment is generally more intense in various ways than it is during the day. There are multiple reasons for this claim, and I think some of our later speakers might go into some of those, but primarily I would highlight the 2 key reasons as being the reduced number of people we encounter at night, which makes the environment more prominent. And second, the role that vision and light often have in helping us maintain some sort of sense of ourselves as apart from the world. And I'm reminded of Dunn's 2016 description of dark landscapes as syncopated, meaning that they sort of bring internal psychological sensations into the external darkened world. And I think this is important, particularly thinking about the conference theme, as it implies that attempts to govern the night through governing the materiality of the built environment are more likely to be a bit more impactful or influential than in the day. Second, I want to argue that social scientists, and I'm talking from my perspective here as a human geographer, have tended to be a little weaker in emphasising the role of materials and materiality, particularly in relation to the night, in comparison to themes such as identity or subjectivity, or affect and emotion. That's not to say that this has been absent, but it does seem less prominent. And again, I think the conference theme invites us to think about materials. And third, in this talk particularly, I just want to kind of focus a little bit on that question of mobility, because I think that perhaps thinking about the materiality of static spaces is a bit more intuitive, whereas actually in the night, there are also ways in which materials act in very mobile ways. And some of the most important materials at night, those associated with artificial light and, of course, alcohol in city centres, push us towards thinking about fluidity. So to give a bit of underlying theory and background, the understanding of materiality and subjectivity that I'm talking about is captured very nicely. And this is, I'm aware, kind of a jargonistic quote, as Felix Guattari and his collaborator Gilles Deleuze were prone to do, but I like it as the way that it captures an understanding of how the self is produced in social science. So vectors of subjectification do not necessarily pass through the individual, which in reality appears to be something like a terminal for processes that involve human groups, socio-economic ensembles, data processing machines, etc. Therefore, interiority establishes itself at the crossroad of multiple components, each relatively autonomous in relation to the other, and if need be, in open conflict. And what I like about this description is this emphasis on both the material and the social, and the acknowledgement of conflict and complexity within that as well. And the idea of subjectivity as an endpoint of multiple different processes fits with a number of kind of contemporary isms and theories within social science, which all share this sense that ourselves are, to a greater or lesser degree, an endpoint of multiple processes, which are neither entirely within the self nor entirely within social structure. And as geographers, and from a geographical perspective, looking at these within perhaps small-scale built environment or the interaction of the built and natural environment of the self emerges as a very interesting process to follow. To add a bit more detail to this, the sort of material agency that I'm imagining in the city at night is highly relational. So to quote the researchers Boyer and Spinney, quote, "The practices connecting bodies and artifacts play a central role in creating the meanings that things come to have." So for the sake of analysis here, I don't want to particularly think too much about any kind of causal primacy between materials and their relations. That's not to deny the importance in other spaces of ontological debate about that point, but just to say that I don't want to dive into it here. The point I really want to make is that I'm looking at materiality in this context because it's interesting and pertinent, but not because I think the material features of objects or people in the city centre are somehow primary to other forms of social relation. And the diagram there at the bottom of the slide is a little attempt to very crudely illustrate that. So for the remainder of the talk, I want to return to those three scenes, and for each one, argue that they show different forms of material action and augmentation. The analytical terms I've given to them are just those analytical terms. It's not a complete framework. As I said at the top, this is intended to be a little bit speculative, and I think you're indulging me in that. So in scene one, we see what we might call an analog biopolitical materiality. No, though not directly citable, I arrived at this term slightly based on some reading of the work of Rosa Braidotti. So alcohol here is being governed based on its biological effects, hence the biopolitical, but in a rather analog way, and analog here meaning not digital. The rule that we're seeing implemented is a form of curfew. It's just about the oldest tool of nocturnal governance in the book. You force businesses to close or stop acting, stop selling alcohol at a certain time, and therefore restrict nighttime behaviour. In a specific sense, alcohol is imagined to make people less responsible and less likely to follow social distancing regulations, and so its sale is restricted to end at 10 p.m. in the hope of preventing late-night drunkenness. But where alcohol and indeed other intoxicants prove problematic at night as materials is that they tend towards the production of excess. And this often gets translated into mobility, the movement of people around cities, around spaces, and also very small scale height and mobility as well. The effects of alcohol are, of course, not biologically determined. They emerge from both socially learnt practices and biological effects on the body, but both lead to a sort of excessive fluid materiality in which gestures become louder, movements become more abrupt, and actions less predictable. So in this scene, this fluidity manifests itself in groups wandering around the city streets and filling them at the time the bars close, often in ways which, frankly, probably made social distancing more difficult than more staggered closing times would have done. So in this sense, the old forms of analogue biopolitics, and I use old in kind of scare quotes because they still persist, are scuppered by the mobility of materials, and in particular by the excessive fluid materiality of intoxicants. As we move from the analogue city to a more augmented city, we start to follow, I think, then the move that Deleuze tracks from Foucault's biopolitics towards his own description of societies of control. We see this then in scene 2, though here we're dealing obviously with something that's not immediately apparently material, light, in some ways often used as an antonym, an opposite of the material. But I think the quote shows both the ways that light shapes other materials and the very material choices that are involved in the production of public lighting. And Tim Edensor, the geographer, has argued that light can be understood as a very material actor in landscapes. He describes it as part of landscape vitality, both in the way that it literally brings life by starting processes of photosynthesis or evaporation, growth and erosion, but also in the ways that different lighting levels change our perception of a given landscape or built or natural environment. So in the quote from this interview, we're dealing with a responsive digital materiality in which lighting level changes as the individuals move through the city. To draw on the work of geographer James Ash, the landscape starts to have a higher resolution here. I'm not literally referring to the higher resolution that light brings to the landscape, although I quite like the pun, but Ash's use of the term to describe how interactive any given object is. So he uses resolution to say that a higher resolution object is one that encourages us to interact with it more, based on its differing capacities or sensibilities. Smart lighting has a higher resolution than the more analog biopolitical materiality through which alcohol was being governed, or through the more analog biopolitical materiality of other forms of lighting, which are based on a much simpler form of light providing humans the ability to see. In terms of mobility, this responsive digital materiality sees the material nature of landscape change as we move through it, although perhaps, of course, not in ways of which the individual can perceive. We can imagine a hypothetical person peering down could see lights moving, coming on as someone moves forward, but of course the person on the street would not necessarily be able to see that movement. And this is a point which forms some of the more critical accounts of this sort of form of responsive materiality and the position of subjectivity in the nighttime city. In scene 3, I think here I failed to copy my quote properly, so I'll skim back to there. We have what I call a digitally driven materiality. The rider's journey is a function of digital interaction. He works for an app on which an order is made, and through the platform he then has to start traveling around the city to enact the kind of real life materiality of the digital transaction. So here the delivery rider sits alongside warehouse packers and fake review writers as one of the people who make happen the material conditions which are necessary for the digital transaction to be enacted. They fill the infrastructural urban background that the digital produces. And within this, we see what appears to be much less scope for agency. The rider has to be responsive, so rather than the digital being responsive, the kind of material conditions of the subject of the rider are more responsive, behaving perhaps tactically to cycle at quieter times or quieter spaces, but nonetheless having less agency as a kind of material actor within that space. So to kind of conclude, as I say, these categorizations I've given you are not intended as a mutually exclusive framework. It's much more speculative, but hopefully as a way of starting to think about the different ways that materials act. And I think that in thinking about augmentation and urban spaces at night, thinking about those multiple forms of materiality could be interesting. Each form of materiality is more or less associated with those other vectors of subjectification. And to look at this in greater depth, we need to start to think about affect, discourse, identity, and so on and so forth. And the mobility of this is important, I think. So materiality is not just about a fixed picture, but is relational, changing, and dynamic. And in thinking about augmentation, what I've wanted to sort of prompt to think about today is that it might have its own forms of materiality in the nighttime city. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Robert Shog. Then next up, can I ask Daniela?
As Dietrich Henkel said earlier, over 80% of the world population are in bed by midnight. And I think that the question remains what they actually do there. So I asked myself the question, where did the sleep go? The only thing that seems certain about sleep today is that it represents a basic human need and can therefore be considered an anthropological constant, at least for the time being. For you don't have to possess much imagination to suspect that the idea of getting by on as little sleep as possible, if any at all, is a recurring dream of post- and transhumanist lobbyists in the San Francisco Bay Area, and that experiments with sleep deprivation, hitherto known mainly from Guinness Book record attempts and military contexts, are an everyday occurrence in the labs of Silicon Valley's human enhancers. It is therefore not very surprising that while sleep has long been a marginal factor in the analysis of the present, it now seems to be taking more and more center stage in a cultural critique that sees it as the last fortress of resistance against the thoroughly technologized, hyperproductive, and networked life. Recent manifestations of such a critique are the two exhibitions Sleeping with a Vengeance, Dreaming of a Life from 2019 at Kunstverein Stuttgart and elsewhere, and 24/7, a wake-up call for our non-stop world, also opened in 2019 at Somerset House in London. While the latter exhibition sketches rather dystopian scenarios of a thoroughly controlled world without possibilities of retreat, Sleeping with a Vengeance asks about the resistive potential of sleep and the possibilities of dreaming, quote, as an act towards imagining the good life, as in Martin Luther King's famous sentence, "I have a dream," end of quote. Both exhibitions are undoubtedly inspired by Jonathan Crarey's now notorious essay, 24/7, Late Capitalism and the Ends of Sleep from 2013. In this, as you probably all know, rather polemic essay, Crarey sketches a gloomy picture of the present, which he terms the non-stop life world of 21st century capitalism. He formulates a sharp critique of our productivity societies, which he describes as a system that not only decimates inactive time, but actually discredits it. Accordingly, sleep as the paradigm of inactive time appears as an affront to a capitalist logic of exploitation. And I quote, "Sleep poses the idea of a human need and interval of time that cannot be colonized and harnessed to a massive engine of profitability, and thus remains an incongruous anomaly in sight of crisis in the global present. In spite of all the scientific research in this area, it frustrates and confounds any strategies to exploit or reshape it. The stunning, inconceivable reality is that nothing of value can be extracted from it," end of quote. 1 year earlier, also Russian artist and philosopher Alexei Pensin, in a note for Documenta 13, qualifies sleep as the last resort against, I quote, "capital vampire attacks at night." In late modernity, sleep is captured in a dispositive of control, so still Pensin, not just for the sake of intensified production, but also in the name of constant consumption, communication, and entertainment activity. Simultaneously, in a post-Fordist society of immaterial labor, when work time is merging with the time of wakeful life itself, sleep acquires a new value as the sole known working time, end of quote. The main cause of the attack on sleep is, of course, seen in digital technologies, not only by all the critical voices briefly listed here, but also by countless contemporary studies that deal with sleep problems from a medical perspective. Insomnia is perceived here primarily as a symptom of an accelerated networked life in which the tablet or smartphone as bedfellows play a decisive role. The radiation emission, the blue light of screens, which interfere with the biorhythm because the body interprets it interprets it as daylight, as well as hypervigilance, that is to say, the constant alertness to possibly receive a call or a message, are all causes of a poor sleep hygiene and are likely to result in bad sleep or insomnia and consequently in health problems. And yet, it has become a large trend that people are trying to cope with their sleep by the help of the very same technologies that are said to cause the problem in the first place. While I type the lines of this paper, which I am reading right now, the screen of my MacBook is in so-called night shift, which means that it turned the colors of its light to a warmer spectrum in order not to trouble my falling asleep later. If I wanted, numerous digital tools and gadgets of sleep could await me when I finally make it into my bedroom. The most banal, of course, my smartphone, equipped with sleep coaching apps or not. This actually doesn't go very well here. I show it all in one. Okay. It could also be a smart mattress, which measures my sleep duration, sleep cycles, tracks my body movement, heart rate, and breathing, and controls the temperature of my bed. I could cuddle with Somnox, the sleep robot, whose aim is to guide me, quote, towards relaxing breathing and helps me fall asleep faster, very less, and wake up rested, end of quote. Or put the app Cool Drift Versa onto my forehead, which uses, quote, precision cool technology to reduce metabolic activity in the frontal cortex of my brain, quieting the feeling of a racing mind and allowing me to fall asleep and find healthier, more restorative rest, end of quote. Of course, capitalism wouldn't be capitalism if it hadn't recognized the economical problems arising from sleep-deprived labor. Despite its discredit as being a waste of time, non-profitable, a threat to economic productivity, more and more companies revalue sleep by taking measures such as offering sleep coaching sessions and seminars to their employees, providing napping spaces, accepting chronodiversity as a reason for flexible working hours, changing the lighting scheme in their workplaces, or survey the state of fatigue of their workers. The ambivalent relationship of sleep and digital technologies is just another symptom for the identification of sleeping troubles and their medicalization as a new possibility inside of biocapital accumulation. This embeddedness of sleep in power relations and political struggles is, of course, not new at all. In his famous lecture, Marcel Mauss characterizes sleep as a body technique. Body techniques, as he puts it, are habitualized behaviors that materialize in bodies and at the same time transcend them because they refer to the nexus of physiological, psychological, and social conditions on which they are based. Walking, eating, giving birth, to name only a few other body techniques besides sleeping, are thus nothing natural, universal, or ahistorical, but always time-bound social and cultural practices. Besides, sleep is characterized by the peculiarity that it can only be experienced by means of media. Sleep can never be perceived as sleep. As Matthew Fuller writes, quote, there is no immanent critique of sleep, only embedded reporters who necessarily have no capacity of seeing. Sleep operates in oblique ways, arriving at a cultural reflexivity only by a detour, end of quote. In order to think about it, we have to be awake. In order to learn something about it, only recording and analysis technologies can give us insight. It is therefore not surprising that the perversion of all human spheres of life with digital technologies does not stop at sleep, especially since it seems to lend itself to such perversion because of said dependence on mediation. Accordingly, the history of sleep research reads in large parts like a media history. A crucial, maybe the crucial moment of sleep research has been the discovery of so-called REM sleep in 1953 by means of the electrotechnical recording method electroencephalography, which in turn had been invented in 1929. The EEG allows the measurement of electrical activity of cerebral cortical neurons by recording voltage differences between electrodes attached to the scalp. With EEG, the description of sleep became scientifically doable for the first time because it was now possible to clearly define sleep and distinguish it from other physical states. With the discovery of the REM phase, not only sleep research and dream research seemed to converge after both strands had always been pursued separately, but it also disproved the assumption that sleep is a uniform and inactive state of the brain. Instead, the REM phase can be observed in the EEG as a pattern analogous to wakefulness and is the sleep phase in which the majority of dreams take place. It is also the period in which lucid dreams can occur, a phenomenon where people are aware that they are dreaming while they are dreaming and may even have control over the content, characters, and settings of their dream. Lucid dreaming is not simply a mental state, as some commentators describe it, but rather a body technique in its own that can be activated at will with a lot of practice. There are countless manuals and self-help books about the various techniques of lucid dreaming inducing. Alina Chia has convincingly shown that these techniques overlap with what is known as dreamwork and include mental, behavioral, and communicational techniques and rituals to both interpret and produce dreams. This process of procuring or governing dreams has a long history and is often referred to as incubation, after a practice that was common in Greek and early Christian times. This is the point where tech's next big thing, as an article enthusiastically calls it, tries to step in. We are talking about lucid dream technologies, on which I would like to make a few preliminary remarks in conclusion. While the history of those technologies goes at least back until the 1990s, the last few years saw an increasing effort to develop those devices that exceed the possibilities of simple wearable sleep trackers by far. Dreamtech. Dreamtech, like the lucid dreamer, the Ailbhe, or Aladdin, as they are called, use smooth EEG sensors to detect the REM phase. Once the dormant is in REM sleep, the devices aim at inducing lucid dreams by different triggers, such as flashing colored lights, audio prompts, and even transcranial alternating current stimulation. While the former shall remind the dreamer that they are dreaming by penetrating the dream narrative, the latter is designed to directly addressing the brain and enhancing a specific kind of cortical activity, so-called gamma activity, to be precise. Whilst dream incubation in former times in different societies, as for example in some Native American societies, was a social act linking the waking state with the sleeping state and the transcendent, lucid dreaming technologies fall under the trend to optimize and increase the efficiency of individual sleep. But although dream technologies promise to take the work out of dream work, they only superficially hide that their aim is actually the opposite. Because on the other hand, they beckon their users with the idea to boost their creativity, solve problems, augment their memory, or turn their sleep hours into a veritable night shift. Already early dream manuals, as Chia shows, question whether sleeping through one's dreams is the best use of a limited lifespan, when lucidity could provide mental imagery of unsurpassed vividness to rehearse skills and scenarios for the optimization of waking life. Prospective or developing add-ons to these technologies point in two directions. The first one is the programming of brain waveforms of specific content to turn the brain itself into the ultimate because most immersive and immediate virtual reality. Whilst dreams as downloadable media content were a dystopia of popular culture, even for Jonathan Crary, today there are more science than fiction for sure. The second direction is the connection of these devices to databases of dreams. Many Dreamtech experts stress the promise of big data analysis of dreams to gain, of course, deep knowledge about populations, societies, and human essence, with the ultimate aim of economic exploitation of the knowledge thus gained. So the idea of dreams as acts towards imagining the good life, to come back to the beginning of my paper, cannot be described differently as a dream in itself, since today, with the help of Dreamtech, they are always already subject to the grasp of surveillance capitalism. Lucid dream technologies in this perspective are nothing less than the Trojan horse inside the last fortress against the 24/7 world. Thank you very much.
Indeed, now we're moving on to speak about lighting. Andreas is going to take us on that journey next. And actually, I was just thinking it'll be really nice, Andreas, for you to expand on this, because it was indeed one of the threads in Robert's talk. So Andreas, can you manage your slides?
Okay.
Great.
Does it work?
It does.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much for the invitation to this interesting symposium, what we have now. And I now want to talk about a little bit about this, what is one of the reasons that we can colonize the night. That's artificial light, and especially artificial light in the last century, especially by electric light. Well, and this light, artificial light, also produces something that we call light pollution. And if you take the picture now here, you see there a city. I think it's on the Canary Islands. You can see the direct light from the city. But you can also see how the light is scattered in the atmosphere, and above you can see the stars. But if you go nowadays into a city, like, for instance, to Berlin, if you go to Berlin and you stand in the center of Berlin in a clear night, look up to the sky, can you see stars? Perhaps yes, you see some stars. You see the famous Blau here, the 7 stars of the big wagon, we call it in Germany. And the question is, why is the sky so bright? Why you can see in Berlin only some few stars? I try to explain it. There are a lot of influence coming from all sides to this Tiergarten, and that is, for instance, glaring light, but it's also light scattered in the atmosphere and the surrounding. And you see there's different causes. You have advertising, you have street lighting, and you have facade illumination. This all contributes to brightening up the sky in a city. And if you look at Berlin from the International Space Station, you see mainly the main traffic axes that are illuminated. But if you look in the center, you see also other things there. And it was the work from Helga Küchli and Chris Kyber that found about 10 years ago, but not using this picture. But they flew with a plane over Berlin at night, and they discovered that about 32% of the light emission come from the streets, 16% about from industry, 10% from public services. We have there commercial centers. We have the airport. You can see very well at this time still the airport Tegel, and of course, as I told already, the illumination of facades. Well, and you see this marked difference between West and East Berlin. Still nowadays, the different illumination technologies in West Berlin and in East Berlin. In the West, you have dominantly white light at the moment. Still, that comes from gas, still old-fashioned gas lighting, but mainly also fluorescent lighting, and nowadays also, of course, from LED lighting. The East looks totally different because in the German Democratic Republic, a lot of sodium high-pressure lamps were installed. These were the most energy efficient lighting systems still some time ago. So you see here the political differences still from the space. If you look closer into the center, you see there are only some few natural dark structures, for instance, the Tiergarten. So these are small refuges for animals, but you also see that there's a lot of light coming up, and we have a very great impact on the rest of nature that we have in the city center. Below, we have two pictures from a satellite that measures the light at night, and you see that we can track there some marked differences. For instance, the picture on the left is from October 2019, the other is from December 2020, and you see on the left picture there was still the bright spot of Berlin-Tegel that was closed in November 2020. On the right, you can't see it any longer, but if you look there, you see in Brandenburg a very, very bright spot, even much brighter than the airport, and that's a greenhouse there in Brandenburg that's mainly illuminated in December, January, February, that we have salad in winter, or we can also buy flowers in the winter. So you see even what we use by day is influenced by this at nights, and you see that's in this case it's mainly technical reasons. But what's happening, as I just showed, the light, upward light is scattering in the atmosphere, and by this way you can see the impact of Berlin even at 60 or even at 100 kilometers distance. So light pollution is far reaching out into the nature. It's in north of Berlin near the Lake Stechlin, where you can still see this dominant light dome from Berlin. And what's the reason for this? The reason for this is that we use more and more street lamps, more and more lamps, more and more illumination. And I've taken here some data I've got from the city of Vienna. If you look at the curve that is showing the red line is the number of lamps that are used in Vienna, and you see a strong increase till about 1980. But from 1980, there's more or less the same number of luminaires, but what's happening then is that more and more effective luminaires are installed, like the yellow ones, the sodium high pressure lamps. They are emitting more and more light with the same electric energy, and what's just starting from 2015, these are the white LEDs, and especially also those LEDs with the strong blue emission, the 4000 Kelvin LED. I just showed it on the right side, the city with the spectra of all the luminaires, so you can see a little bit the differences, but you cannot see already the impact of the LEDs because it just started in 2015, 2018, it was not yet so much. So the number of luminaires and the more efficient luminaires are increasing the emission of light. And I show you here a picture I have taken during the years from 1979 to 2012 from Paris. And you can see the change of the color. And this means also the change of efficiency of lighting. At the top, it's mainly mercury vapor lamps, which emit about 50 lumens per watt. In the middle, it's the characteristic yellow lights from the sodium high pressure with 120 lumens per electric watt. And finally, change to white light. It started already before the LED epoch with the metal halide lamps, which amount the same amount like sodium high pressure, but especially white light. So you see higher efficiency. You get light gets always cheaper, and you can illuminate much, much more. Another example is, for instance, this city where it's not necessary industry or what needs light. It's simply the leisure, and you see the light made it possible to colonize the night, especially here, very well. And the interesting thing, you see how it changed over the time. And if you look closer to the pictures taken from the International Space Station, you also see how the light color changes in the different quarters of the city. But one interesting thing is, if you look at the picture at the bottom right, you see that all the luminous around this advertising and so on is much brighter than, for instance, the street light. Yeah, this illumination of the street is much, much fainter even than many German cities, but it's enough. Yeah, and if you try to find there some stars, it's even difficult. You can find a dark spot within the center. I found it, could take the picture there. That was really the brightest sky I have ever measured and seen. And here again, you see the impact. If you go some 100 kilometers away to the National Park of the Death Valley, you can still see the light dome from Las Vegas at a distance of 170 kilometers. And you even can see the lights from Los Angeles at a distance of more than 300 kilometers. So this is also a waste of energy. So just to summarize this before I show you some ways how you can reduce it, these are more luminous. It's also due to more land use, to increased infrastructures, a loss of nature. The higher efficiency, you need less energy and you can produce more light, the so-called rebound effect. You have the LED lamps that are glaring, so they need shielding, and then you have less trail light. You see how much electric energy is used for outdoor lighting. It's 2.7 petawatt hours per year. You see the number behind compared to the amount of electricity that is produced in Germany. It's about 10 times renewable energies in Germany. So that's lighting for the whole world. And of course, it's a lot of CO2 that's emitted, and it contributes to the climate change. As you see on the left graph, it's increase of use of electricity for lighting, and just from the last days, from the World Meteorological Organization, the increase of CO2 and also the temperature. So you see the impact on our climate also. It's a small fraction of all electricity use, but it contributes. So what are solutions? I just want to show you two examples. The European Union had this Green Public Procurement Program, GPP, and they form something like a LARA, as low as reasonable available. You should illuminate it, and adaptive lighting, illuminate when you really need it. One example is the city of Springe. It's about 23 kilometers southwest of Hanover, with about 30,000 inhabitants. You have here also the data from the satellite. You see the city is here. These are some measurement points from the city. That's Hanover. And in Springe, it was for a long time they used to switch off at night between 1 and 4 o'clock in the morning. And these are the measurements from the satellite of the upward light. And you see that didn't change much. But in 2018, the politicians thought that they have to illuminate all the night. And so the light emission at night, because the satellite measures it about 2 o'clock in the night, increases a lot. And then they said, okay, we have to reduce these costs in 2019, and they installed new lighting, and it was a lighting that could be reduced according to the traffic. The blue is a traffic density, and you see that it reduces during night, and in the city they decided also to reduce the light down to about 30% of the normal brightness, and you can see it in the picture. You have a typical lighting level in the pedestrian zone and on the streets of about 3 lux after 10:30 in the evening. So it's really an adaptive lighting. The other example is the so-called Star City, Fulda, a city with 70,000 inhabitants, and something like good example was the Star City Flagstaff in Arizona in the United States, long known, I think, since 40 years as a star city. You see the comparison of the pictures, the same exposure times. You see that Fulda is even darker than Flagstaff, so they have the same number of inhabitants. The aim is to use full cutoff luminous street lighting that only emit light downwards, to use warm white lights with low blue contents, 3000 Kelvin color temperature, and also to limit the light amount by a deal about light, I will show you later, and to modify the facade illumination. We hope that the lighting plans of Fulda could be recommendations for other municipalities, because they have also some bylaws for lighting and design. So you see what must be changed, that the illumination, for instance, of the cathedral, you see that on the right picture, that a lot of light is emitted over this cathedral. You see that shop windows, for instance, are much, much brighter than the street illumination. So there is a trade. If you want to illuminate some of the historic facades that are not very much illuminated, then you have to reduce the light from the windows. And another thing that should not be, that's, for instance, here you have a facade illumination of a building, and it's so bright that it even illuminates the house on the other side, so that the inhabitants complain that they cannot sleep at night. 20 lux, that's too much. They also have a demonstration road where you can see how to use a good street light that is full cutoff. It's at 3000 Kelvin color temperature, or even this yellow one, like the old-fashioned sodium high pressure lamps. And this shows that you can see in the villages of the Star Park Rhön, you can also use this sustainable lighting in the cities. Is even possible there. Berlin, for instance, has this NITE master plan and illuminates, but also illuminates some of the buildings like the Brandenburger Tor very brightly. Just if you remember, when it was built, it certainly was not illuminated so bright. But just 60 kilometers west of Berlin, you have one of the star parks. That's a nature park, West Haveland, where you can see the Milky Way very well. And why not think about this, that perhaps you can reduce light during night, certainly not so far, but reducing light during night, as Dietrich Henkel already told, after midnight, nearly everything stops and reduces. You can do it by just using responsible lighting, adaptive lighting, by reducing it at night. Thank you.
Andreas, thank you so much. That's how incredibly interesting. The whole time I was thinking, I wish that the Irish local authorities were listening. and I'm sure all of the people listening from around the world here today are thinking something similar, that they wish their governments would take on board some of this. But I think you're right. I think there are good examples of best practice in this regard, and it's hopefully will just be a matter of time before other municipalities and cities take it on board. But certainly lots of food for thought. Thank you very much. I'll leave the rest for our discussion at the end. Annette, can I ask you to upload your slides?
Yep, hold on. I think you just have the wrong one. Well, hold on. No, I think you have the right one. Yes.
Great. We can see you and we can see your slides. Take it away, Annette.
Okay, so far we've heard a lot about the idea of using the night, and on the keynote last night it was said that this could be an extension of our busy days in the city, so why not shift some of the activities into the night? And this is indeed a very, very tempting idea because, well, why not use the night, carpe noctem, seize the night? We can sleep at another time, can't we? If we think about modern cities, we have this picture, and we see this in all the science fiction movies for, I don't know, 30, 40 years. So you have lots of people out of about, you have lots of light, you have lots of life out there. Most of those probably want to get some entertainment, but we all know there are lots and lots of people working for this, keeping up the infrastructure. There's the whole health system active during night, and many companies, they work at night because it's for economical reasons. And Dietrich Hänel said we have this idea of a 24-hour society. We are capitalists, we want that. But Dietrich Hänel also said that reality is different. Most people choose to work during the day, and only few people work at night, and there are only certain people who work at night. So most people sleep during night. Why is that? And there's a very, very obvious reason for this, and this reason is melatonin. Melatonin is a hormone, I guess you all heard about it. It's quite often in the news, and it's usually called a sleep hormone, which isn't entirely correct. It would be better to call it a rest hormone, or the best thing would be a darkness hormone. Why? Melatonin is only produced during night, during darkness. But it gets a bit more complicated because our body has an internal rhythm when to produce melatonin. So if we would take away all the light, it would still produce melatonin in a roughly 25-hour cycle, which doesn't really fit to the sun cycle of 24 hours. So what's going on? Every night when the sun sets, our brain gets the information, come on, it's night, it's time to start melatonin production. And about an hour after sunset, this usually starts if it is dark. And then in the middle of the night, a bit towards morning, it's still dark here, but our body ceases to produce melatonin, so it actually knows how to prepare for morning. And then melatonin levels go down, even during morning time, stay low during the day. And with the next dusk, this starts, dusk, this starts again. So there's a rhythm underneath that. And melatonin, we know it is related to sleep, but it does so much more. Melatonin controls our entire internal clock, our entire body clock. And this is not only important for sleep. Melatonin controls almost all hormones in our body, like adrenaline, like estrogen. All physiological functions in our body run on this clock and are controlled by melatonin. Melatonin is important for reproduction, for growth. It's important to protect our brain, our entire nervous system. It activates our immune system and it plays an active part in this. It's the best antioxidant you can imagine. Forget vitamin C, forget goji berries. Get your own melatonin, your body's own melatonin, and it will boost your immune system. And it also fights against cancer cells very actively, and it prepares the body to fight cancer cells at night. So melatonin, in a way, is an absolute super hormone, and we really, really need this. But we can only produce it during night. And as I said before, it's somehow related to sleep. Well, when melatonin levels are low, we tend to be active. We tend to be out and about. So there seems to be a connection between melatonin and sleep. Now, why do we sleep? We've heard before that sleep is often considered as a waste of time. We're just lying in bed or on a sofa. We don't look very nice when we sleep, mostly. Why do we do that? One of the reasons why Thomas Edison was so keen on inventing a light bulb was he wanted to get rid of sleep. The thing is, we actually do a lot when we're asleep. Well, parts of our body do not much. Our heart, our lungs, our digestive system, our muscles, they all calm down, they all go to rest. But the rest of our body is active. In the first years of our life, we grow during night. We really grow during sleep, and our feet or our legs are longer when we get up in the next morning. When we're adults, our body repairs itself while we're asleep at night. Another thing that we do at night, well, you hopefully don't dance at night. I mean, not physically, your partner wouldn't be happy about that. But every movement you learn during the day is rehearsed by your brain at night, and the informations are sent through your nervous system to your muscles. And while you sleep, probably in REM sleep, we're not absolutely sure, but while you sleep, your body trains these movements. So a dance step that was hard the evening before might work out the next day. You slept over it. And the same is true with all other information we gathered during the day. So everything we've learned, we've read, we've seen, we heard during the day is filtered at night. Everything we consider as important is transported from the short-term memory to the long-term memory. You can actually see the electric waves moving through your brain. Everything that's not moved because it's considered unimportant or because you haven't slept enough is labeled as garbage and it's thrown away. So we need sleep to learn. So students should learn and sleep a lot. And there's another thing going on our brain. We have a cleaning service at night. During the day, there are lots of substances adding up in our brain. One of them is the so-called Alzheimer plaque, which plays a part in dementia. Every night, this plaque is cleaned out from our brain, but we have to sleep to do that. If we don't sleep enough, it seems, research is going on this, that we have a higher risk of getting dementia and Alzheimer. So you can get the idea that we're actually doing a lot during sleep and that it's really, really important for us. So what happens if we don't sleep? Or what happens if we don't sleep at night? And there's lots of research on night shift workers or on people who, for other reasons, don't sleep at night, maybe during the day. And it's a bit scary, actually. The first thing we know is our immune system goes down. We are more likely to get sick and we need longer to get well again. We all know that if we don't sleep enough, we get cranky, but it actually can cause depressions. It can even increase your suicidal behavior. So your life might be at risk. You have a higher risk of drug use because you're tired in the morning or whenever you have to get up, maybe in the night for work. So you use coffee, you use nicotine or other stimulants. When you have to go to sleep, you need sleeping pills to go to sleep, and this is all very bad for your body. As I said, we have a higher risk for dementia, for Alzheimer. We also have a higher risk for obesity after diabetes, because if we're tired, we tend to eat sugary, fatty food and not the healthy stuff, and we tend to eat too much. This can result in cardiac diseases. Our blood pressure can rise. We have a higher risk to heart attacks. Your risk of infertility is increased, even your risk of miscarriages. So if you're pregnant, please sleep at night, don't work at night. In many countries, there's a law against this, and there's a very good reason for this. And we also have a higher risk of certain cancer types like breast cancer, prostate or bowel cancer, maybe even thyroid cancer is fairly new research. So our body literally breaks down. So sleep is immensely important for our health. And this sleep has to go together with melatonin. And for melatonin, we need darkness. Here's some data from a research paper from 2000. And you see here in these participants, they have really nice rise and lowering of melatonin levels during night. Now you have dim light. 3 lux is about reading light at your bedside. It can already suppress your melatonin levels, but we can usually deal with that. That's okay. 100 lux, this is a dimly lit restaurant. You see this is an immense impact on your melatonin level. And 9,000 lux, this is daylight, dim daylight, but there's no melatonin produced in your body. And you see that you can't catch up on this melatonin. We lose it. So having bright lights in the evening or being active during the night and trying to sleep during the day isn't a good thing for our body. Now, what are we doing in our cities despite this knowledge? Because let me tell you, this knowledge is not many physicians are aware of this. It's a bit scary, actually. We want to have an eternal day in our cities. We brighten up our cities with lots and lots of lights, indoors and outdoors. We want to get rid of the night. And you can guess this isn't a good idea for many reasons. Instead, we should do something else. We should seize the night, indeed, as something special. We should understand that the night is a very special time of this 24-hour day. We need the darkness of the night, and we should embrace that. That doesn't mean that we can't go out. We don't need to sleep the entire dark phase. We can have fun in the evening. We can go out with friends. We can go out dancing. But we should avoid bright lights. We should calm down at night, and we should use the special night atmosphere. And we should also use it in the cities. Night is a very special thing. Let's keep it. So nightlife should be different than day entertainment life to begin with. And then we should rethink how we use lights in different parts of the city. This is an area where there's nightlife, okay. But let's look at this area. This is in the center of Berlin. Here, this is Reichstag. During the day, there are lots and lots of people here, as you can imagine by looking at the benches. This is at 8 o'clock on a December evening. There's nobody around, but the lights are full on. Why? We're wasting energy, we're wasting money, we're producing light pollution. It's not good for these trees. Why are we doing this? Why don't we dim down the lights? And even further, we have lots and lots of areas where people want to sleep at night. They need to rest at night, and they need darkness to do this at night. So instead of illuminating all the streets brighter, 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 and instead of doing all these light spillage, which Andreas Hänel has shown, we should make sure that we have areas where we can sleep at night in darkness. And the same, of course, is important and true for nature. So what are my take-home messages for you today? There's three things. Night is for sleeping. And as much as we would like to have a 24-hour society, we cannot change our biology. If we want to do that, it comes with a price tag, and this price tag might be really high. Sleep is an essential part of a healthy lifestyle. If you think about healthy food, if you think about exercise, don't forget sleep. It is as important as the other things. And if you want to have healthy sleep, you need darkness and you need quiet. And if you plan a city, if you think a city, we have to consider these nocturnal needs. We have to make sure that there are areas for nocturnal rests, dark and quiet areas where people can slow down, can go to rest. And we also have to consider this by making people work at night. Some people are fairly okay for this with a couple of years, but it should be a voluntary thing. We should not force people into night work, and we should keep our society in a way where people have the option and actually the right to sleep at night and to rest at night. Thank you.
Many thanks. So everybody, thanks Annette. Lots of food for thought there, especially amongst many people on this call who are all about activities at night and who may have some very differing opinions, but we welcome all of that discussion, and thank you. There's lots to think about there. And I, on a personal level, I couldn't help but think of all the sleep I'm losing because I have two small children. and feeling that I was definitely, if I was to go by your slides, I'm doomed. So I'm not sure what advice you have for parents, but when there simply is no sleep to be had, but there you have it. So can I open up the discussion? We had had 4 very interesting papers. Just to kick us off, and I'll get into the chat after that, something that struck me about a few of the papers was this idea of people acting in relation in the night. I know that Robert, you mentioned this, but so did Andreas actually when we were talking about things like adaptive lighting and how that can be in relation to people's movement. And I just wondered, as regards thinking about the night and relationality, have you anything to say about how that can happen in an organic way or in an artificial way as such, or if I was to use the language of this conference, perhaps in an augmented way? Andreas, do you want to come in?
I think it's a difficult question. Some people say that these adaptive lighting with the motion detectors might help, or some call it smart city. So in my opinion, it's just a modern expression for this. But I know some examples of adaptive lighting where I would say, okay, when they have the low lighting level, it would be sufficient. You do not need to illuminate much more at night, because also our eyes adapt to the darkness. Yeah, that's Annette told about melatonin, but also our eyes, our whole vision system adapts to night. We have two cells, nervous cells in the eye, because we are adapted to day and to night, yeah, to the brightness and to darkness, yeah. So I think more that this adaptive lighting is more general according to the light traffic, as I showed, so that at certain times you can reduce light. You not necessarily need to switch it off, but you can reduce light. And I know also some examples where that's technically terrible, bad made, but I think that perhaps we have to do some more technical research on how to realize such adaptive lighting. But I think this general also, again to the talk this morning by Dietrich Hänel, that the city in general changes. Yeah? For instance, also not necessarily Berlin, but where I live here near Osnabrück, a medium large city, you see that most traffic reduce already at 8 in the evening.
Thanks, Andreas. Robert, do you mind if I swing to you, because I'd like you to talk about the social aspects of the relationality I'm speaking about, if you could.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I think it struck me really, I suppose, in relation to all three of the other speakers as well, was there is, and indeed building on Dietrich's talk, is there's this tension between physical capacity, the capacity of the body, the kind of materiality of light and kind of how that helps us see and not see certain things and different light sources, and then a whole load of pressures that have been characterized as kind of expansionary ones for kind of colonization of the night, as Dietrich talked about. So I guess that theme has really struck me as an interesting one insofar as just that point that we reach, and you can dive into your marks here, right? If we really want to dive into kind of social science literature of, well, capital always wants to overcome spatial and temporal boundaries. It's always seeking ways to expand production, expand consumption, expand market. There is always an expansionary force going on. And in relation to time and night, it hits a load of kind of different barriers. So that I think that's one really interesting point that seemed to come up across these other talks in terms of kind of, I guess, within social context. Of course, one of the things I didn't really talk about very much at all was difference in terms of identity, in terms of subjectivity. I perhaps hinted perhaps that I was coming from a particular perspective, but clearly, and in the context as well of the broader research project that you're doing on kind of migration, an obvious kind of point here, and I think Annette really touched upon that idea that night work should be optional. It shouldn't be something that people are forced to do. And of course, one of the things that I'm sure your research is exploring is the fact that migrant communities are more likely to work at night, they're more likely to be forced into that position, exactly because there are a whole load of reasons that people don't want to work during the night time. And therefore it's undesirable, so people are more likely to seek it. If you're more desperate for work, find it harder to get other employment. So I think that perhaps, I don't know, I might be slightly rambling now, but I think it's really interesting to start to pick up that question of who chooses to go into the night, who's forced into the night, and also the tensions that happen as we hit the boundary between daytime and nighttime activity.
Thanks, Robert. Actually, just to pick up on what you were talking about regarding difference, I agree. Yeah, it is typically there is a sense that yes, people are forced to work at night often, but as you say, there's also choice involved in that. And actually, Annette, I'd like to link back to you on this, because in what you presented to us, is there a danger of thinking about how people engage with the night in a very homogenous way? And my thinking here is that, okay, and on the one hand, you're giving us the science behind why we need to sleep at night, and obviously very good reasons for that. But, you know, not everyone's the same, as we know, and you know, people, you know, I'm just thinking of as far back as the 15th and 16th century, when we had this thing called a double sleep, you know, when people woke up in the middle of the night and were active and you know, had played games and sang songs, etc., and then decided to go back to sleep for their double sleep. So my point being, just when you were speaking, it was presented as if this was the case for every single person, you know, across the world, religions, cultures, etc., needs to sleep at night. And I suppose I can't help but question that. Have you a response to that?
Yes. For all we know at the moment, yes, every person has to sleep at night. There are no exceptions. But we have different, we call it chronotypes. We have people who are absolutely happy with getting up at 6 o'clock in the morning, but they want to be in bed at 8 in the evening. And we have other people who are quite happy to work until midnight, and they're fine with it. Although it seems that people who tend to work late at night are more susceptible to health risks. So it doesn't seem to be the best way of doing. I'm a night owl myself, so I wouldn't put it too hard, and maybe it came over too harsh. It's not that we are not allowed to do anything at night. You mentioned these people in the 16th, 17th century who were active during the night. What is activity? They were talking, they were thinking, they were having sex. So it's like, it's a different kind of activity than standing in a bright artificial light and having to work and having to concentrate because you're in a factory, for example. I think there's a huge thing about quality of things. And I think it's also, if you choose to be active at night because you're in a creative period and you want to work, or maybe you're in your early 20s, younger people can deal with night work better than older people. That's another thing. And you feel that you're okay with it for a time, that's fine. And you need this time, you need time to recover. But what we see is people who work every night and have really these reversed shifts. Sooner or later they get sick, and we have to be aware of this. So we have to be careful. We have to listen into our bodies, and we have to find, it's like walking on a tightrope. I don't want to say I be at bed at 10 every night and never dance a night through. That's fine. You can do that. You can have nights out. It's okay. As long as you find time to sleep through nights again and again, and listen to your body, and don't expect this to be like this for the rest of your life, because then you might realize that it's not good for your health. And the problem we are having is all these medical issues I was talking about are medical issues we're having a lot in our society. And it's hard to pinpoint what exactly is the reason in one person. And we tend to say, oh, it's the stress, it's unhealthy food, it's too much smoking, too much drinking, whatever. We have to take sleep into account there. We have to realize that our sleeping habits might not be the healthiest we have. and we have to consider this. But in the end, everybody has to make their own decision, and I definitely won't tell anybody not to be active at night. That's not my place. So enjoy that. Just be aware that you might cause harm to your body. And the important thing is we must not force people to do it. I think that's the thing. It should be optional. And we should not see it as the ideal for the future, that we just uncouple ourselves from these biological rhythms. That can't work.
Okay, and actually, Annette, I'm going to, because this question in the chat directly links to what you're talking about, I'm going to stick with this for the moment. This is from Derek Pardue, and he asks, what is the role of age as it relates to melatonin and biological health? And also, to what extent is the human body adaptable to how it produces melatonin? I'm thinking about long-term night workers. My aunt, who's worked for over 40 years as a nighttime nurse.
Well, there are two things. For one, several things. The older we get, the less melatonin our body produces, even if we have decent darkness at night. That's one of the reasons why elderly people find it harder to sleep and don't sleep that much. They have a lack of melatonin. The other thing is this chronotype I was talking about changes during life. As you know, as a mother, young children are early birds. They get up at 6 and are absolutely happy. When they become teenagers, it's really hard to get them out of bed before 9 o'clock. They are sitting with open eyes asleep in school, and it's really their body clock. It's hardwired there. We can't change that. It doesn't have to send them to bed at 8. It doesn't work. And then when we get older and older, we're tending to get earlier and earlier and earlier. So there is a difference in age. And we also find now, talking about night shift workers, there have been some studies, there are lots of studies on night shift working nurses, especially about cancer. And it seems that nurses who work night shifts as young women and then stop working them, they recover. But especially elderly women or women who do this for 10, 20, 30, 40 years, they indeed have an increased risk of cancer. It's not that they necessarily have to get cancer, but they have an increased risk. So if we talk about shift work, like Dietrich Henkel said this morning, maybe it's not something for everyone. Maybe it's something we should do in a certain period of life. But shift work also is, if you're an owl, if you're a late chronotype, working at 6 o'clock in the morning can be even worse for you than working a shift till 2 o'clock in the night, because then for you, your body is set to accept 6 o'clock at night. That's hardwired in your body. So there are personal variations in there, and you have to figure out what's the best shift for you. So maybe you're an evening worker, but we have to be careful about these core nights of the core hours of the night. They should be kind of sacrosanct in a way. But once again, it's not absolutely written in stone.
Thank you, Annette. Daniela, I think this links in quite nicely with your work on all of these, I suppose, all of these companies and the industry that has flourished with regard to people seeking sleep and seeking dreams, even at that. And this lucid dreaming I thought was incredibly interesting. And indeed, any of you that have watched Black Mirror, I'm sure where these images you had were very much in my mind of something that needed its own episode of Black Mirror. But Daniela, have you anything to say about this that we've been talking about?
Yeah, sure. I actually, I'm a mother of 2 young children myself, and so actually this was the kind of the starting point of my thinking about sleep, because I was awake so often during the last year in the middle of the night, and I was kind of furious sometime about all the sleep I lost, about the injustice between parents and so on and so on and so on. So so I feel you, I would say. Yeah, I think, I mean, all those technologies, of course, are a kind of a symptom, yeah, a symptom of the sleep deprivation we face at the moment. And the point that I wanted to get across was the ambivalent status that sleep has in all those developments. So on the one hand, the sleep deprivation due to digital technologies, night work at night, and so on and so on. And on the other hand, the idea of getting to an optimization and a better efficiency of sleep with the help of the very same technologies that are causing the problem. So
this is interesting, isn't it?
And I think melatonin plays a very decisive role in all those attempts, in those startups that are trying to experiment with that Dreamtech. I read about melatonin teas people are experimenting with, and I think that goes all in the same direction, right? It's this kind of this mixture between new age philosophy on the one hand and extreme tech on the other hand, and then this kind of liberalism that inherits or that sits in the Silicon Valley area. And I mean,
yeah, that's very interesting. Actually, Daniela, just I can't help but ask, I mean, have you come across any research, particularly when you were talking about people, you know, having their phones with them in the bedroom, etc., being this hypervigilance, you know, and this constant anticipation of a call. Do we know anything about how that's affecting children? And I'm thinking in particular probably of teenagers who bring their phones to the bedroom, etc. Do we know anything about this yet?
Yeah, I mean, there are myriads of studies about this, and how, especially in our pandemic time, there is an increase in screen time of children and young adults, and there are so many studies claiming exactly the same, so that our children and young adults get more and more sleep deprived due to the use of digital technologies also in their bedrooms, of course.
Yeah, thank you. And actually, I see that the questions are coming in fast and furious now. From Katie Young for Rob, did the 10 p.m. closing time shift the time frame of the night out or encourage an earlier start to going out at night in Newcastle?
Yeah, thanks for that, Katie. The answer is probably no, partly because it was very much a kind of a temporary COVID-19 measure, and in fact, it's one that's been dropped in the UK in the sort of latest round of hopefully, fingers crossed, I guess, final unlocking of end of lockdown. The first bars, as I mentioned, reopened in April, and that curfew has been removed precisely because actually its main effect was at the end of the night, where it did just meant that all the bars had to close at the same time, and you had the thing of everybody being out on the city streets, and particularly because it wasn't combined with a similar restriction on off license, so the ability to buy alcohol from a shop and take it home, it was probably counterproductive, I think. So no, not in that case. I mean, there is a heritage, I think, a longer heritage in England anyway, of there was a fairly strict time limit on alcohol sale across the country until outside of nightclubs or hotels until the early 2000s. Before that, I think it was, memory serves me now, it was 11 o'clock, and that itself had been extended from earlier closing times of about 10 o'clock, I think, until the 1970s. And I think that's actually created a drinking culture where people are more likely to go out earlier in the evening anyway. I think it's contributed to that. And I think the legacy of that remains in kind of people's learned habits and routines and rhythms, which comes to a kind of a key point of some of the stuff we've been talking about, that so many people's nighttime rhythms are learned, and they are a colleague of mine, Robert Hollands, did some excellent research in the 1990s, again within the British context, about the fact that kind of young people were sort of following the same routines of going out that effectively they'd learned from their parents at a time when there'd been a lot more heavy industry. So the kind of the going out patterns still fitted the sort of the patterns that had kind of emerged out of the relation to the opening times of the shipyards and the closing times and when the kind of shifts were. And actually people still followed the same paths sort of through the city centre from bar to bar that previous generations had had. I wondered, I thought of that actually in relation to what Daniela and Ailbhe were just talking about in relation to young people and social media use at night. I think it could be really interesting as the Generation Z gets older and starts to hit their sort of mid-20s and become workers, as to how this kind of extended period of time use of social media, will they carry that with them? So will that be something which is actually tied to the teen and early 20s experience, or will it be something that now having been learned is much harder for people to kind of lose as they hit their working lives and kind of full adulthood, which is speculative thought.
Yeah. Just on what you were saying about alcohol, Rob, because I was thinking about this during your talk, and you've just referred to it again. So, and I understand, you know, that absolutely these are learned behaviours, etc., about these drinking cultures at night. But I began to think, well, if you had the same level of drinking during the day, which of course socially is a big no-no, you know, what is it that is particular about the night, that if you drink alcohol during the day, people act in a certain way, and if you drink alcohol at night, people act in a certain way? Can you talk about how particular that is to the night? Because it's the same, if you think about it, it's the same, you know, you talked about the alcohol leading to excess, I suppose, is what I'm linking back to. And I just wondered, well, does it lead to the same excess during the day? And if not, why not?
I think it's a really interesting question. I probably have lots of thoughts. I'll try and be... I think that a big kind of piece about kind of how drinking happens in city centres, and you know, I must say here at the moment I'm being kind of quite public space, city centre centric in some of my analysis here, and some of these things may not apply in other contexts. There's been research which has really explored this concept. I think it's Smigin. It's a Hungarian name, Szmigin, so apologies for my mispronunciation there. Smigin et al., who describe what they can, I think they call it a controlled hedonism. And there's this slight idea that there is an othering of the time space of the night. Again, kind of Dietrich slightly referred to that in his talk earlier, in which actually people have this perception that if it's after a Friday at 5 o'clock, and again, kind of within the UK in particular, in the city centre, there's a set of things which are allowed in that time space. And those are kind of independent of things like whether or not it's light or dark. So, you know, here in the north of England, we are relatively high up in terms of latitude. It gets dark at about 4 p.m., maybe even 3:30 in the middle of December, and dark at sort of pushing 11 o'clock at night in the middle of June. I'd say that at 6 p.m. on a Friday is pretty much constant throughout the year, actually, how the kind of nighttime city is. Maybe slight variation around kind of festivals. So there might be more cultural things around kind of Christmas, perhaps, kind of Christmas parties and other activities. So I would say yes, basically, but that drinking is different at night. But I would probably put that down more to the social cultural rhythms than, say, rhythms of light and dark. And other features as well. Some of the research I did, going right back to my PhD, was with nighttime street cleaners. And, you know, going out with them, riding in the Swingo lorry, as it was called, which kind of swept up all the stuff that was deposited on the floor. And one of the things that struck me is that part of the reason people feel free to go out and behave in quite raucous ways at night is that all the evidence of that is not there at 6 in the morning. You know, it's removed, it's cleaned away, the vomit, the litter, the everything is gone, and there is that sort of resetting, which is obviously important, and it's, you know, it's necessary for a whole range of good reasons. But I think it has this secondary effect of almost of reinforcing that boundary of here's a time space in which you can kind of you can party, you can act differently. Speaking of day drinking, and do stop me if I'm rambling, but I think that kind of festivals can have that similar effect. Here in Durham, we have, which is the city I live in, there's the Miners' Gala every year in July, which is a huge kind of trade union event mixed with kind of local festival, in which people march from what were once mining villages into Durham city, carrying banners behind the local brass bands, often marching for kind of a good 10 miles or so, or driving to the edge of the city and marching in. And their drinking starts at 6 or 7 in the morning when everyone gathers and they drink and, you know, kind of march with packs of kind of cider and lager. But the point there is there's that same boundary kind of around it, you know, because we have this event, it is a time and place in which that kind of drinking can happen.
Lovely. Thanks, Rob. And I think it's also that idea of resetting when you close your eyes for sleep, perhaps. If I'm to link back to people's talks about sleep, you close your eyes, you wake up again, and it's a new day. It's a new beginning as such. Nice. Here we have a question for Andreas from Sarah Brandolero. Can you say a bit more about the different lighting policies, provisions in Berlin, and impact on quality of life, impact on nature? The image you showed of East-West Berlin was fascinating.
Yeah, I already answered her on the chat.
Okay. Well, I'm sure we don't like to hear.
Well, as I told already, the yellow light in East Germany was mainly due to the fact. That's at least what I learned was due to the fact that the German Democratic Republic, they had to reduce energy use, and so they developed this yellow sodium high pressure lamp and installed it quite often, especially in Berlin, to save energy. That's, I think, the main reason that they still use the yellow lamp. And you know, the time scale that street lighting is exchanged is very, very long. And if there's an impact on the life and impact on the quality of life, well, I can't say this. Perhaps you should, because I do not live in Berlin and I do not know any publications about this. You should perhaps ask the people living in Berlin, like Annette or Dietrich Henkel. But he perhaps knows more about this. If there are studies about the impact of light on quality of life, I do not know at the moment. Sorry.
Does anyone want to jump in?
Unfortunately, we don't really have these studies. I'm trying to convince the Technical University that they should do some, because we're getting lots of complaints by people about all the bright lights, and we have all these norms saying, no, the lights are okay, they're not too bright, but the people say, but I think they're too bright. So we have a huge conflict here, and some people are working on this, but we don't really have anything conclusive so far, which is sad. We have some ecological studies, of course, which show that the bright or the lights in Berlin are a problem for nature. Although Berlin is considerably dark compared to other cities the same size. So there are bigger problems in other cities. But this is definitely a research topic we have to focus on.
Great. Thank you. And I'm going to we've only a couple of more minutes. So I'm going to finish with a question from our host, Manuela. Thank you very much for the great lectures. I would like to take up Ailbhe's idea that sleep is also a little different for everyone. If we generalize this observation and if we sharpen this thought to a more differentiated analysis of the night, rather than general statements about a constant takeover of the night by work, insomnia, extraction, exploitation, light, etc., would perhaps also be too simple indeed. What we hear in common in the lectures is that we come to a transformation, and that perhaps now other people, other places, other practices are relegated to the nights. Is this the case? That is a big question, Manuela. Would anyone like to take up in about 1 minute you each have to make a comment on this?
I'll take one start, and it is a really productive concept which I've found in thinking about some of these sorts of questions. I kind of followed the colonization of the night kind of concept from Melbourne fairly literally, and thought, well, what if we turn to post-colonial literature and to think about, well, what sort of colonization actually are we talking about? What do we mean by colonization in this context? And the concept which I found really helpful from that is the idea of the contact zone, which is an attempt to describe colonization. My understanding of it, and I'm not a post-colonialist, and I am slightly aware of the problems of kind of applying ideas across in this way, but my understanding is that it's an attempt to describe spaces where colonization happened more through perhaps a kind of the colonizing population taking kind of control over, not politically so much, but perhaps more through kind of social mixing through trading posts, for example, through rather than kind of say direct governmental control. And I think that might be the sort of colonization that's going on when we talk about the day and the night. So there is an unequal relationship. There are these pressures of kind of insomnia, exploitation, extraction, and so forth. But actually, rather than this being this one directional push down of power, it is much more of there is contact. It's an unequal relationship, but it's one in which both those expansionary pressures are changed and the night is changed as well at the same time.
Thank you, Rob. Anyone else like to jump in?
Okay, then maybe I think what we should not do is take the night as one homogeneous thing. There are different parts of the night, and we should focus, or we should just understand there's an evening, there's something like midnight, there are the early morning hours. This is all part of night. And there are differences in their quality and how people use them. And I think if we do that, we can find a way to use the night and to colonize the night to a certain degree. What we should not attempt to is to make the night just another part of the day. I think the night is a very special thing, and we should accept this special thing as a good thing. And otherwise we wouldn't have nightlife. I mean, what is the difference between going to a pub at night or going to a pub in the morning? It's a very different quality, and we should keep this quality. So we should not see the night as simply an extension of daytime, but as something we're using in a very special way with the special characteristics of the night. And I think this would be a really interesting way to do this. And then we can find, if we keep times for sleep during the night, I don't think there is a fundamental problem in using the night. Just need some hours of night where we actually sleep, and then some hours of day to fill that up. But we should see the night as a special time of this 24-hour cycle, and not just of something we want to get rid of.
And actually, I'm gonna end it there because we've come to our time, and I like the fact, Annette, that you've finished with saying the night is a special time, and certainly I think everyone at this conference can agree with that. Thank you to all of the speakers today. It really was a fascinating panel, and it certainly broadened my horizons on the way I think about the night. So thank you very much for that. I'd like to invite you all to come back in roughly 2 hours. We're going to have a little bit of a different session in 2 hours. It will be a round table, and it's going to be about designing diverse cities at night. That's at 6 p.m. Central European time. Here in Ireland, it will be 5 p.m. and in the UK, and I'm afraid for anywhere else in the world, you'll have to do your own maths. But that's roughly 2 hours time. And please as well note that tomorrow we have a packed day of papers again. And in fact, tomorrow is going to be opened up to the whole HERA network. So we've a good day in store for you tomorrow too. Have a good break, go get something to eat, maybe even have a little nap if you're not, if you're going to be up tonight for whatever reason. And thank you all. Thank you to the panelists, and we'll see you all soon.